In this episode of the Smart Community Podcast, I have a great chat with Crissy Ditmore, the Director of Strategy for Cubic Transportation Systems, where she is working on the expansion of mobility as a service across the globe. Crissy is also Chair of the Board of the Travel Spirit Foundation North America, Co-Chair for the Mobility on Demand Alliance Public Policy Committee, is active with the Coalition for Smarter Transportation, and a 2019 Mobility as a Service Transit Magazine Top 40 Under 40. So it's fair to say that she was a perfect guest for our Mobility March series. In this episode, Crissy and I discuss her background of over 15 years in the mobility industry and why she's so passionate about the opportunity for mobility to be an equalizer and reduce divides within our community. We talk about digital equity when it comes to mobility, especially for mobility as a service, and the importance of real stakeholder engagement in this space. Crissy shares with us her perspective on the future of transport and how mobility is only one part of the value chain of happiness in the smart community ecosystem. We talk about the importance of enabling equity through policy decision and how emotional intelligence in difficult conversation is what is needed for better integration and fewer silos. We finish our chat discussing the emerging trend of balancing new innovation with improving on existing solutions, as well as the things that Crissy wishes were trending in mobility. As always, we hope you enjoy listening to this episode as much as we enjoyed making it.
Welcome to the smart community, smart regions, smart towns, and smart cities. It's where we live, work, and play. With smart communities, the future starts today. Big data, smart mobility, emerging trends galore. The Smart Community Podcast is what you're looking for.
Hello, Crissy. How are you today?
I am fabulous today. How are you?
I'm also fabulous, so that's lucky. Let's jump straight in, and can you tell us about your background and what you're passionate about?
So I have been in the mobility industry for about 15 years, which most people talk about mobility, especially multimodal mobility, as a rather new topic. And really, it's just been around forever. So I like to say I have been a geek for a very long time in a very specific industry that's all of a sudden becoming cool to other people. But I remain firm in my geek origins and have been really part of watching this amazing future unfold with new technology, with new partnerships between the public and private sector, new approaches to how everybody interacts with each other. So it's fascinating and exciting at the same time. And I'm pretty honored to have been part of it for this long.
Yeah, wow. And so I guess you're very passionate about mobility.
I always have been passionate about mobility, mainly because where I grew up, we actually didn't have great public transportation. We weren't well served. And as I got older and went to other places, other cities, I really saw the benefit that it provides in terms of it's kind of the one area that it doesn't matter where you're from or where you grew up or what money you had even, you have the same opportunity as everyone else. It's one of the great equalizers of history. Just having access to wonderful transportation can elevate you to whatever part of that community you want to be part of. So it's always been very exciting and encouraging that you can become whatever you want because you have the mobility to get there.
Yeah, that's so true. And something I've been thinking about a lot and looking at a lot and researching, and it can be that great equalizer. But on the flip side, if we aren't well serving, if we're only well serving certain areas, then it can actually rapidly increase that divide as well.
Yes, especially why the community of people with disabilities is getting louder. They're saying we need to be part of this equation and not an afterthought, because that divide in many countries is becoming even greater. And so as those opportunities increase, depending on how they're accommodating a variety of needs, does also limit. So it's not even just the area that you serve, it's what are you taking into account for the people that are in that area. So obviously, you're never going to be able to meet every need all the time. But if you're very narrowly focused on delivering one type of service to one type of user, you're greatly limiting your own community's ability to interact and be healthy and happy and productive members of that same society.
Yeah, and it's, that physical accessibility, but then there's that now we've got this digital accessibility, which is something we really, really need to consider, because as much as we can say, oh yes, this is an accessible, bus or something like that, if you have to order it on an app, but you don't then teach people how to use that app, or maybe they don't have that app or smartphones or whatever, we really need to think about those channels so then we can meet the most needs of the community that we can. And I've been thinking, again, looking at this from when we built the transport network, particularly in Australia, and I guess similarly in America, it was built for the businessman driving to and from work without any children or, any other things happening along the way. Whereas now, and rightfully so, people of all different abilities are using the same network, and women and children and, people going here and there, not just necessarily to work. And the people have had to adapt to kind of fit into this network that wasn't made for them. And now I think we're having these conversations. And like you said, you've been working in this space for 15 years, but now it's become a hot topic. And I think we need to really use that, not as just a, flash in the pan kind of, hype and buzzword thing, but actually how do we use some of that energy, enthusiasm, and which that comes with money and focus to actually serve these really basic needs that we haven't met yet.
So yeah, let's talk about digital equity, because I think that the technology part of this conversation is an important one to keep bringing up. So you talk a lot about smart communities, and in my opinion, a smart community is a purposeful city design that allows you to maximize citizen welfare. And that's through institutional, physical, social, and economic infrastructure. Notice I didn't say technology. A lot of cities do use technology to help bridge that gap, but we're having an ever increasing divide of intelligence around how to use technology, as well as a equitable divide of who can access the kind of technology that you need to leverage to interact in that environment. And it becomes alarming. So I work for a company that provides technology. And, many years I've worked at different companies, and most of them provide some kind of technology. And it's a constant conversation. How do we meet the need of the person who doesn't have the smartphone? And how are we intentionally building our own products to be able to, number one, be used by those who may not have had a lot of training in the use of those systems, but two, how to make sure we are really thoughtfully thinking through how to address their needs. So part of this, when I talk about mobility as a service, especially MAS, I like to say MAS is not an app, because an app is never going to define for you a policy end goal that meets a public good. That's why when we're designing these systems, many times it is in the best interest of everyone that a public sector entity is in charge of the policy making, so that those that have vulnerabilities in some way needs are met. And in any of those cases, an app is never going to meet that need in and of itself. So in all of this new mobility framework, making sure you're having the conversations at all of the companies, at all of the government institutions on ensuring the needs of all are met, but also trying to close that digital divide, because that is one from a learning aspect and from a access to aspect that we're starting to see. It depends on the data point you use, actually. Some people will say almost everyone has access to a smartphone. And then other studies will come out that say the opposite. But I know when I'm walking through downtown New York City, there are homeless that do have phones. I know some of them do like DoorDash kind of delivery services because they have access to a phone, and that helps with them to be somewhat employed. So they have some access. So even talking to people on the street, you see there is a level of interaction. Whether it meets that full typical smart city technology framework, I think is where we have a gap.
And I think that's why, that engagement, like you said, is so important. We can look at studies and things, but which are very important, obviously research is highly important. But then when we're actually looking at these projects and things for specific communities, for example, we really need to go into the community and talk to them and actually create this with them. And I think that's something that's shifted, particularly in the time that I've been looking at this in this space, that engagement piece is so important. And which I guess it always was, but now it's kind of like the real engagement, and that people think that, or people know, even they need to start to think that they have a stake or have a say in the outcome. Because I feel like in the past, people go, oh, well, why would I bother? It doesn't change anything anyway. They've already picked the project or whatever. Whereas I think with smart community projects, it must be co-created, which is a bit of a buzzword, but the essence of it means to actually do it with the community. So then they feel, or they are, not even feel like, they are part of the journey and the decision-making process. And, you have to work with them where they are as well. And also realize that it's not just necessarily taking a poll and then going with, okay, well, this part of the community wants this, so we're going to do this immediately. There's obviously, policy, regulation, there's city plans, there's all these things that feed into that. So we need to work with professionals, obviously, in this space as well. But yeah, I do feel like particularly in mobility, people feel like they haven't had a say for however many years. Whereas now I feel like we can actually do that together with the community, and they can feel like they're part of creating mobility in their communities, which I think is a really great thing.
So that community storytelling that you're talking about is super important. And I do think that they're starting to see a different voice being necessary. So instead of, consultants go into cities and they tell cities what they need, I think a lot more are starting to understand the benefit of first interacting through the community leaders that are local anyway. So instead of, early in my career, I lived in Anchorage, Alaska. Hilariously, I know that's not normally something people say, but I worked for a transportation company there, and we were contracted to the city to operate one of the services for them. And so I really got to know in the community a lot of the people that were the advocates on many levels. And sitting through especially public testimony for, you'd get a new mayor and they would propose cutting transportation budget for whatever reason. And really the benefit of just starting grassroots campaigns to get people to some of these meetings. And it's really informed my own career and my own perspective on how to best involve different members of the community, because many times, board call for comment sometimes during the day or at 7:00 at night. So you're going to get two different kinds of people, because you're going to get people who are working and can't attend, or moms who might actually need that service and have to take care of their kids at night, or you have a member of the community that has to use public transit, and public transit stops at the same time as when the open testimony would be starting. All of those things were things that I could very personally see, and how that impacted the outcome of what could be decided. If you weren't at the table, your voice wasn't being heard, but they weren't making it easy to have your voice heard. So, really grassroots campaigns of working with churches to bring people to meetings and creating childcare at those events so that people could bring their kids. It really formed for me on a small scale how to take those community conversations into a larger scale. but not for me to lead all of the conversations, to highly leverage the people that lived in those communities and were already trusted in that environment to tell us what their needs were instead of the other way around.
Thanks so much for sharing that. I was just thinking about, we've talked a lot about, what a smart community is. I'm keen to hear what you think smart mobility is, or whether you even use that term. It's a term that I use, but I'm not super wedded to it. But looking at the future of transport, what can you see really changing in this space?
I think that mobility should be tightly coupled to healthcare outcomes and increasing successful communities because they have a targeted approach that makes it not just siloed. So we're not going to talk about just mobility. We're going to talk about mobility and how individual choices impact the environment, which leads to a better or worse healthcare crisis in that same community, and how all that's kind of like a whole value chain of happiness. So if we are increasing transportation options, and public and private and all different kinds, because people want to get around in different ways, but encouraging all of those actions in a way that improves our overall environment and then therefore can improve my happiness and satisfaction and level of health. I can be healthier and happier in my community because of the options that I have for mobility. I can also probably decide as I age, I might want to age in place, but still interact with people in my community, which then enhances an elderly person's happiness and health. So all of these costs in that value chain go down because one part of the ecosystem is supporting another part. So it might mean we are paying more into funding transportation infrastructure and options. And because we've invested in that, the cost that we are in the local community having to spend on healthcare goes down because people are healthier. And part of the way that we make that happen is implementing equity also by design. So there's a lot of conversation, and now I'm going to bring up a topic that I'm going to get yelled at for, but there's a lot of conversation around all public transportation must be free. And the opposing viewpoints are, well, if you make that free, then, healthcare should be free and all housing should be free. And all of these are really great thoughts, but impossible to pay for everything. And I think what we need to be doing is leveraging more of a enabling equity through the decisions that we make in our policies. So the people that are the most vulnerable or need the most help receive more assistance than average people using the system. And all of these are very political movements, highly politically charged. Everyone's going to have a different opinion. And I'm not saying I have the right answer to any of those. But I do think that when we are talking in silos, so if we're only talking about transportation, then we're missing a bigger point that we can enable to make the entire cost of that value chain go down by improving housing and improving healthcare. And all of these things actually do interact with each other.
Yeah, and I guess that really leads to integration. And I'm keen to hear how you think we can better integrate across those different disciplines, because as much as we can, say, focus on that holistic view, which I'm 100% for, that integration piece is quite difficult now because we're in silos. Keen to hear some of your thoughts around integration across different industries, as well as government agencies, industry, and the community.
So I really wish I had all of the answers. And
you don't have all the answers?
I know. It really makes me feel inadequate some days.
Oh, me too.
Those that know me best will say, I think I have all the answers, but in reality, I know I do not. So I do think that people are starting to realize the benefit, and there are some transformational leaderships at high levels of government that are more willing to let some of that control go in favor of the greater good. So I do believe that in small pockets, this is happening, but at more national levels, at country government levels, I think that it's going to take a lot more effort. And what it really means is at some level, each side of the conversation has to give. And this really gets down to emotional intelligence of everyone in that environment and how to have difficult targeted conversations in respectful ways. And we know based on the international political divide right now that sometimes that's really hard to have. So coordinating conversations at the highest level, sometimes very difficult. And that's why I go back to, I always see the best benefits happen at a hyper local level. So if even we start the conversation at a very local level on one-to-one meetings or events that could then potentially be drawn into broader societal conversations. But I hear often, I'll go to conferences and they'll talk about a major health institution held an event to invite members of a community with a specific disease that required treatment. So in a city, and I won't name names, but in a specific city, they held an event that they had all kinds of healthcare workers to come and they would get treatment for this thing that they had a rise in that particular community. And when they held the event, no one came because the health community that initiated it did not speak with the transportation community to provide access to it. And there was no public transit that served that event. So all of the people that could have received really beneficial help that could eventually then potentially stop the spread of that in that community, it was kind of a waste of time and money for everyone simply because they didn't go the extra step of having a broader conversation amongst additional stakeholders. So it really takes self-analysis of maybe I don't know everything about this particular conversation. Who else can I talk to that might bring some benefit to the table? And there's a lot of willingness in some respects and unwillingness in other respects to have those conversations.
I like that story. Well, I don't like the story, but the moral of the story is, and something I talk about is that it's not good enough anymore that we're wasting resources on this purely because we haven't been able to change our, thinking and actually thinking a bit broader, because it doesn't take much to have a conversation. It would take a bit more to, have services there, but at the end of the day, it may have been a successful event, and helped people. Like at the end of the day, that's what we're trying to do. And so I think in this, one of the reasons I think this smart community or whatever we want to call it thing is so important is because we really need to shift our mindsets that we have to do it differently because it may have worked in the past. I think people get really caught up that, well, I've done it like this, and if I do it some other way, it's saying that I've done it wrong for the past 20 years or whatever. But that's not the case. We did the best that we could for the time that the resources that we had, the time we had available, the knowledge that we had. But now we have so much more, not just technology by any stretch, but just that integration of, people, community, people's, like individuals are changing the way that they do things purely because obviously life changes, but they now have access to all this information and different jobs and, this globalization that's happening and all these things. And so it doesn't make sense that we, keep doing it the same way. But from a mobility perspective, I think we, particularly in America and Australia, this reliance on the car, we can't really see past that. And so I think when we do talk about public transport, particularly if you're living in a regional area, you're kind of like, well, I'm not part of this conversation, but I feel like that mobility has to then link in with, well, what does that mean for my community if I could have something different? What if public transport could look different in my community? But we need to start opening up those conversations to people that wouldn't normally be involved in those.
Yes, agree. And I think that the people who are leading those conversations and have been for a while are sometimes change happens in a way that you don't expect it. And so your goal may have been going one direction, and that goal might change over time, which means you have to take a new direction. Change does not equal defeat. And for many people, that's kind of what it feels like. So some of it is suspending your own ego for a minute and trying to think through, maybe changing the approach or improving on the goal is okay and maybe even preferred. But making that the mental choice to be accepting of that is sometimes really hard, especially when you've been fighting so hard for one direction. And you're right, there's a lot changing internationally, and globalization means sometimes somebody's going to bring a totally different approach, and it may be beneficial to listen to or to test that in a new environment.
Well, let's talk about emerging trends. And can you tell us about the emerging trends that you're seeing that people aren't talking about enough?
Well, I think one of the, it's not a trend, it's something people aren't talking about enough, is simply just because it's new doesn't mean it's good. And sometimes the best option is improving on something that we've been doing for a while. That sounds weird coming from a person who likes, new and innovative approaches. I think that when we're having the conversation on the new and innovative approaches, let's not abandon the good that we've been building upon at the same time. So I think there's not enough conversation about the things that have been done well, and why aren't we trying to put more effort into that versus, how can we get this newest thing up and running fastest? So, a few years ago, the word was blockchain, and everybody needed something in their programs that had a blockchain component. And I think that's one of those technologies that is a technology looking for a solution. They're looking for a need, and not necessarily the other way around. So as time goes on, it becomes less and less part of, specifically in mobility. There are definitely other applications that you could talk through. But when I think about this, I worked for a van pool company for a long time, and so I could be biased just a little bit. But a van pool is kind of a big version of a carpool. You get a lot of people in one vehicle. There are even electric vans that are coming onto the market. And when you look at the investment that it takes to do some of these broad infrastructure projects, as opposed to really marketing the capability of choosing to ride together, if you do have to drive, from a suburban environment not served by public transit, there are existing capabilities. Carpooling, how do we really enhance people's desire to just share space? In addition to, yes, we need to fund our transportation infrastructure. So there's a lot of really unsexy things that are very important to the things that should be trending. So I'm going to not answer your question and talk about the things that I wish were trending, because we talk about autonomous vehicles a lot, automation a lot, what that is going to look like in terms of congestion. And we have the opportunity right now to start heading that off by encouraging shared actions amongst people who use those services, and by changing congestion management in cities so that a broader share of the use of that service is borne by the choices that you make. So if I choose to drive myself one day, it will have to financially impact me, and the greater good of sharing that on public transit, whether it's a bus or a train, should be a easier choice, because I have really funded a network that meets the needs of more people. So I think that there's things that I wish were trending, things that are trending, and whether or not the things that are trending are the things that are going to actually deliver benefits for people remains to be seen.
Yeah, I agree. I really like your answer to that, because at the moment and one of the things I looked at when I went on my fellowship around the world was that we are talking about autonomous vehicles, and that's all well and good. And I've just had Michael Milford, who has given us an autonomous vehicle update, which will go out this month as well. And I love talking to Michael because he's very pragmatic, and, well, this is where we're up to, and, they're doing research in this space and that type of thing. But yeah, we did talk about then, the sharing aspect. We really need to be focusing on that, because it won't just happen by accident. We won't put public transport into areas that really need it by accident. It must be a focus. It must be a dedicated policy and plan, and this stuff that's quite dry and boring, but that's the stuff that's going to make a real difference, right? And I mean, right. I and it's also really challenging stuff. I shouldn't say it's easy, but you can plonk in one of those autonomous shuttle things in the middle of a town, but that doesn't meet the need. Meeting the need is the challenging part, and the most exciting part, I think, because that's actually where you can see transformational change. And yeah, so I agree. I think the other things would be, we can make them start trending, and in a way that's not just, okay, they're trending today and they're gone tomorrow, but actually having conversations, and it's something that we talk about around the table, which I think that in this transport space, it's never been sexier to be in transportation, which is a bit strange, but we need to use that, leverage that attention and, the funds and stuff that are available, which I think is what I was saying before, to actually start thinking and talking and actioning some of these really basic needs. And when I say basic, it doesn't mean they're simple to solve necessarily. There's lots of complexities. Mobility is very complex, but it doesn't mean that we should forget about those basic needs that need to be met before we start looking at, people are going to technology is going to be interesting and sexy, and that's fine, not evil, but we do need to then bring it down to, well, what does that do for our communities, particularly people with the most at stake if we don't get this right?
Yeah, I'm constantly trying to think of, I think technology is good, and so I want to be able to enable it, but I only want to use it if it is meeting a good. Mm-hmm. So what's the reason for enabling that technology? And is it meeting a greater good? What have we defined what we think that greater good is supposed to be? And kind of moving from there, as opposed to starting with the technology and going looking for a reason.
Yeah. So where to next for smart cities and communities?
Let's see. I think that is a loaded question.
Well, where to next for smart mobility?
I think that for especially what I am working on and what I think needs to be worked on in terms of mobility as a service, which is kind of the more recent iteration of something that was called transportation demand management, is really focusing on the need for sharing, which means we're going to have to get comfortable with being around people and what we mean by sharing, and how we as a whole community make different choices that may be uncomfortable or outside of what you typically would do. That translates not just to the people using the services, but the people designing the services and the entities that are in the space of doing business. So coordinated conversations among stakeholders, both public and private, that are much more looking towards a public defined common good and how we can come together to meet that need. That is probably the number one thing that I'm working on in trying to ensure that while our environment is at stake and the health of the people in our communities is at stake, that there's a lot that mobility can be doing to enhance the outcomes of all of those other aspects of our community. But that means that we have to start actually getting outside of our comfort zone and talking with people who may have opposing opinions and viewpoints of our own, and trying to truly understand where they're coming from so that we can find a middle ground of, it may not be everyone's choice every time, but how do we start bringing more people to the table to enhance that conversation?
I really like that, because we get told a lot to, not necessarily in work, but, personally, to find your tribe and then just kind of hang out with them, and then, and that's all well and good for support and build you up or whatever. But I really try hard to talk to people that have different opinions to me. Sometimes I can't understand why they have that opinion, but I do my best to find out. And sometimes it's because they don't have enough information. Sometimes it's because they just don't care about it as much as me, rightly or wrongly. Other times they actually have information that I don't have. And so I think it's so important in both our personal and professional lives. We need that diversity of thought around us. And that doesn't mean you're always hanging out with people and, not having respectful conversations or anything like that. It means, can we actually get to a place where we are actually, diversifying what we're thinking about this stuff, because it does affect everybody. So everyone has a stake in this, which I think is something we need to really think about a lot more, because even if I think mobility, sometimes people think public transport, but no, it's our cars, it's how we can walk around. Can we access the footpath? Can we access all these other things? When you start talking about it like that, you get a bit more buy-in from people rather than just, oh, well, I own a car and I drive around and I don't affect anybody and no one affects me. But that's really not how it is. So yeah, I really try and talk to people that, maybe have a complete opposite opinion to me and really find out why it is. It doesn't mean you have to agree with everyone, because you won't, and that won't happen. But I think that's so important particularly when we're moving into this, this new age where technology can be a real leveler, but we can actually, it can do the opposite as well. So we really need to continue to build that community around not necessarily thinking the same, but having open minds about what the future could be.
I think that's one of the most fun parts of travel. And,
Yes.
I, as well as you, get to be at a lot of conferences and events, and there's a whole aspect of that I have, I struggle mentally with myself of the impact that my travel is having on the environment, but also the impact that having those conversations has on progressing this solution set. So one of my favorite parts of that is being able to have conversations, and having the respectful conversation is hard for some people, but I think much easier than people give it credit for, because when you have one-on-one conversations, that's kind of the difference of having an argument on social media versus having an argument in person, sitting at a restaurant, walking up and talking to a total stranger. A lot of times those are actually difficult conversations, can be easier amongst strangers because you don't have a personal stake in the game. Having difficult conversations amongst stakeholders that are in your own space, well, people have something to lose and they don't want to be controversial. And sometimes those conversations are the most beneficial and bring about the most benefit to end users, to the citizens. So they're super important to have. I love talking to, in different cities, I actually talk to homeless people a lot because they really know their city and how they got into that position, to see where the gaps were in safety nets to make it so that they were in that position to begin with, or even the social institutions that they're trying to use to help get out of that situation. I love talking to people waiting for the bus and seeing what they think about changes that are happening in their service or in the environment. I had a hilarious conversation with someone recently that was arguing the benefits of why I thought it was so important. I don't even remember how the subject came out, but why I thought it was so important for people to take public transit and really leverage that system as much as you can, get the most out of that system. And I made some comment of it's most beneficial to the environment to get as many people using that service as possible. That's going to be one of the biggest environmental impacts. And this gentleman went into a long reasoning of why environmental change, climate change, why all of that was not real and how I was being lied to and whatever. And I really listened to everything that he had to say, because I need to know why people think this. And, is there any kernel of truth to why they feel this way? Just things that you should constantly be asking yourself, but also kind of how to combat the conversation, like how to bring up better talking points next time of why a person would think this way. But if all of that wasn't the case, in my head, I thought through, okay, so he had a preference for driving a car. And in my head, I was like, you would never let your car go beyond its preventive maintenance schedule because you know it's much more expensive to pay for the after effect of not regularly getting an oil change. So why would you not have that same approach to caring for the environment? Even if you thought climate change wasn't a thing, wouldn't it make more sense to have some level of preventive maintenance so that you're not impacting it and in the most maximum way possible? And those different thought processes of what's acceptable to one person versus another is always fascinating to me.
Yeah, me too. And I think it also depends how much time you've spent thinking about these things as well, because some people haven't spent a lot of time thinking about these things because they've got other things to think about. So then when we do ask questions like this, it actually gets them to think as well. No matter what their answer is, we're starting these conversations that could do things differently. And like you said, in a respectful way, you can actually then, shift people who might not know this. They might do some more research, that type of thing. And then maybe we can move forward. But I think we're never going to all agree on even the facts of the world at all times. So,
right.
But yeah, no, I agree. I love talking to different people and particularly, when I'm traveling around, just getting different countries and people in living in different countries and how we can actually learn from them without having to do absolutely everything the same way. And I just love it. It's awesome. It's been so great to chat with you, Crissy. Thank you so much for coming onto the podcast.
Thanks for inviting me, Zoe. This has been a lot of fun, and I'm a fan, so I like hearing everything that you have going on and really taking all of the lessons learned internationally and being able to use them in other places. I think that's awesome.
Thanks so much. I really appreciate it. And I've really enjoyed our conversation as well. So we'll have to have another one and we'll have to meet in person at some point.
Perfect. Over coffee.
Yes.
Love it.
Yes. Let's do it.
Great.
Okay. Well, just have one last question, which is how can people connect with you?
You can follow me on Twitter and Instagram at FabCityCrissy. I do a lot on LinkedIn as well. So there's a variety of ways to interact and seeming ubiquitous at times of having conversations with people. But my favorite is one-on-one. So if I'm in your city, coffee is a necessity in my life, and I'm more than happy to have multiple cups with new friends.
Awesome. We'll take you up on that. We'll put all the links in the show notes as well. And people can click away and find you. So thanks again for coming onto the podcast, and we will talk soon.
Great. Thank you. Goodbye.
Okay. Bye.
The Smart Community podcast is brought to you by My Smart Community. If you're trying to deal with disruption, not sure what technologies to buy, need to facilitate genuine collaboration, then we can help. Email hello@mysmart.community or head to www.mysmart.community/consulting.
Thanks so much for listening to the Smart Community Podcast. Show notes for this episode and all other episodes are available on our website, mysmart.community/podcast. If you have any questions for us or any of our guests, you can email hello@mysmart.community. You can also find us on the socials. We are on LinkedIn and Twitter @SmartComHQ. That's com with 2 M's. If you are enjoying the podcast, please hit subscribe so you never miss an episode. And we would love for you to leave us a rating and review at wherever you listen. This really helps us reach more ears and eyes, so thank you for your support. As always, we hope you enjoyed listening to this episode as much as we enjoyed making it.
The Smart Community Podcast is what you're looking for.